call the meeting back to order. We have the regular survivorship and adjustment and corrections.
Madam Chair, members of the board, printed from the last board meeting, we have processed 54 applications. Of course, again, this is kind of our slower time of the year, but as Jeff was pointing out, Madeline is on the report. She's on page 40, and she's our individual that will be in the newsletter for 65.68 years of service.
Where is that at?
On page 40, she's about the, yeah,
Holy cow.
about the 9th person down under.
Oh, I see it now. That's the lady from Anaconda?
Yep,
Oh,
she
wow.
retired.
Susan Fox retired?
And the last 2 years have been part-time.
Yeah.
Really? Yep.
I just don't see it.
65 years? Oh, good God.
That's gotta be the record.
I'd be lucky to make
It is,
25.
Yeah.
I did you know, the research we could and what data we have in our system, and as well as asking Carla, who was here for 30 years. And it's, as far as we can tell, it's the record.
Did she break the software, or were we able to cut the other?
Yeah.
Well, she's getting 1/60th, so
Yeah.
65, by the way, she's getting more than,
Yeah,
yeah. It didn't break the software, but yeah.
yeah, she's getting.
Wow, that's awesome. And how, oh, wow.
That was never even a concept that somebody would get over 60.
So yeah, for the past 5 years, she's actually earned less to work than she would have earned.
Yeah,
Right.
and especially she went part-time the last couple of years.
Yeah.
She didn't want to work full-time, but she didn't want to retire. Yeah. But, I mean, yeah, she just really enjoyed it.
Oh,
That's
how
way
sweet.
cool.
That is
I
really
think we
cool.
should send her a card.
I think so.
That's pretty neat.
Yeah, do you realize how sound our system would be if everybody did that?
Yeah.
Oh, what
Yeah,
our
you would
system
do
is.
it.
I have several
How's that?
administrator friends that could take advantage of that.
Yeah, we'd be doing really well.
Wow. The school districts won't like us very much.
Well, I don't know.
All right, Denise, you have the legal counsel's report.
Okay, Madam Chair, members of the board, for legal counsel report specifically, there's very little to tell you. We have still one contested case matter going on. Mr. Zabrocki is fully briefed before the hearings examiner at this point. That was as of the end of October 28th, I believe, was the last submission of findings of fact and conclusions of law. So I anticipate we will have a determination from the hearings examiner anytime now. I can't, guesstimate when that might be, but he's been very timely in all of his work previously, so I don't expect him to go. I expect to be able to notify, either me or Mr. Zabrocki's legal counsel of the right to submit exceptions to the proposed findings of fact and conclusions of law, and request oral argument before the board, and I anticipate that this will all happen in time for you to hear that matter in February, if somebody chooses to. I could be wrong, but I certainly anticipate we'll have a decision from the hearings examiner in time for that to happen. So, that's the only
So we
contested
might hear
case
from
matter.
our lawyers in the meantime then.
You will definitely hear from your lawyers as soon as we have a proposed order from the hearings examiner. Yep. And again, I anticipate that will be Mike Kaufman who will make contact with you. We have no other contested case matters. I'm sorry, were you?
Oh, I was just gonna ask, a year or so ago when the independent record asked for that permission of information, was there ever any follow-up from that? Did they ever utilize it for anything that we're aware of?
No, they've never, not that I've seen, they didn't, we provided limited information, the information we agreed to provide, and I have not seen where they have ever used it for anything.
See, you know, they used to, that made the first request, is not working for the training.
What was his name?
Can't think of them.
Working
Working
for
for the
the
IR, you mean, or?
No, the Tribune.
Great Falls Tribune? Oh, that's
I
terrible.
see his name
I can't
about
remember his
once a
name.
week, but I can't remember what it is.
James,
It's not Martin Kidston.
no,
Uh,
I thought he was, what's her face?
I might-
quick, but
Yeah,
I might
right.
remember by the end of the meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so,
Yeah.
that was from the website. They published on their names.
right.
I looked at it and, oh, this could be interesting.
Uh,
Got a new job.
So otherwise, we continue working on, as Sean said, we will be looking at legislation. We have, a list of potential legislation changes. We have the cumulative list from the IRS. Now, I have not looked at it yet to determine whether we're going to be required to make statutory changes in 2019 to comply with new IRS requirements. As of October, they had not provided any. I'm not sure whether there's a new list out because of potential changes related to the proposed tax bill. There were some proposed changes in the tax bill that in some circumstances UBIT would now apply to public pension plans. Still in conference committee, but that could be an issue for us.
Remind me what you bid is.
Unrelated business income, which of course, state governments, other governments are typically exempt from, but it could apply with respect to some investments. It's not entirely clear. I will tell you that the entire NAPA conference for February, which I'm not attending this year, I'll go to the summer conference in June, but the entire NAPA conference in February is dedicated to the potential tax changes based on the tax bill and primarily the potential UBIT changes. So if those go away, I'm not sure what they're gonna do in February, but.
Yeah, we'll have to figure something out. I did pose the question about that though to BOI, because Denise brought it to my attention that it was in there, and I just, I asked them, what does this mean? And they really didn't know yet either. They said they're following it, kind of to be determined. Even people in their industry don't really know for sure what it means.
I've seen that with certain partnerships being held inside IRAs where
Yes.
there's some taxation that normally wouldn't happen.
From my quick reading of UBIT concerns, it would potentially impact things like, I'm not sure if it would, private equity.
Yeah.
If by chance we are in partnerships where there's a taxable interest, and, in past, whether or not a state government's been involved in those kinds of arrangements has been irrelevant because you're not taxable.
Right.
But if this, tax bill passes, we may be. So just as a heads up. But other than that, again, we're just going along. We're going to review our administrative rules. We've got legislation to look at. We have the ongoing security program, policies and that to get drafted, the records and information management, which are, significantly related to the information security concerns and that as well. So all that kind of work continues, but we have no other legal cases pending at this point, and hopefully we won't for quite some time. So,
Right into board
go
and staff
right,
training, yeah.
okay. I would like to, if you don't mind, go to page 53 and do the board member per diem election form first. I didn't make separate copies, so if you wouldn't mind completing this form, if you all remember, if you are duly employed by public entities, you may only receive compensation from one employer for the same period of employment. So for the days that you travel to TRS meetings and receive the $50 per diem, you can't be paid by your other public employer for that same period of time. You can do one of several things. You can either receive the per diem and waive your salary with your regular employer. You can receive your regular employment salary and waive the per diem, or you can accept both and reimburse your regular employer for the per diem payment that you elect. You are not violating the requirement if you are using vacation time with your regular employer to come and work for TRS, and you are not required. It is assumed that you are doing your prep time for TRS after hours, not during your regular work time. So it really truly is the time that you are, off-site with your regular employer and working on behalf of TRS that's at issue. So if you are not employed by another public employer, you're going to mark the first line on the form. Otherwise, you have to identify which of the other options you are using to account for your dual public employment. And if you want a copy of the form after you complete it, I can certainly make you one, but I didn't bring up separate copies to have.
You need the whole social security number on there?
No, you can give me just your last four.
Well, I'm not authorized to receive officer.
Data security problem that goes around the table.
I
Okay.
figure they already have mine,
Yeah.
so.
I have to tell you, it feels to me like this next, the ethical conduct and conflict of interest, comes around way more than once a year. But this is the regular time we have, scheduled in our annual calendar for this training. Now, last board meeting, we did a more expanded version of fiduciary training. There's a lot of overlap. We focused primarily on the cybersecurity issues and that at that time, but so some of this is going to seem very fresh when we talk about it again. And Jeff, I guess you're the only one, I'm gonna go ahead and pass these out now, I'm sorry. I don't know if we've gone through the ethical conduct training since you've been here, where you've completed an annual statement.
No, you haven't.
So that'll be a little bit new for you, but I think everybody else has
No,
gone.
rewind for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly. So, starting on page 46 of your board packet, you have TRS's ethical conduct and conflict of interest policy, last updated by the board in September of 2014. At the back of this policy, we'll note that there is a cross-reference to the state of Montana's ethics policy, and well, maybe I'm wrong, maybe there is not a cross-reference. Anyway, there is a state of Montana, and it's cross-referenced, is it?
On the 17th.
Right, okay, very good. It's incorporated by referencing here anyway, but what you need to know is that while the state has the policy, before we go through this training every year, I review the state policy to make sure that if there have been any changes made, that I incorporate that in the TRS policy as well. As long as you know you're required to comply with the state policy, I try to make it all be sort of laid out for you in one place. So, be aware that there's a state policy, but complying with this policy should meet the needs. And the reason TRS creates its own policy in this respect is because you're fiduciaries as well as state employees, and the reality is that the ethical concerns, conflict of interest concerns for fiduciaries are substantially sort of broader and more involved than just the ethics policy for state employees would bring us to. We're not gonna go through this line by line, but to sort of put it in a nutshell. Well, first of all, there are always two clarifications I like to make based on the makeup of our board. And both for the people on the board who are also members of TRS and involved with entities like MEA, MFT, and for those of you who are not. Because a couple of the questions that always come up is does somebody have a conflict of interest simply because they are both a member of the teachers' retirement system and a member of the TRS board, and the answer to that question is no, you're not. As long as you understand that when you're sitting at this table, you are acting in the best interests of all of the members of the teachers' retirement system, and your personal interests don't exceed the personal interests in general of all TRS members, you're acting in conformity with your fiduciary duties, and you do not have a conflict of interest. The same thing goes with respect to your participation on the MEMFT board or any other employment or board representation for a similar entity. Again, you act in the best interests of TRS membership when you're acting on behalf of the TRS board, and you are not violating, nor do you have a conflict of interest simply because you have another responsibility, fiduciary or otherwise, that could appear to be in conflict. As long as they are not actually in conflict, you're fine. So any questions on that particular issue?
I think the only part here that cracks me up is like when we go to these things and you're eating. And for us, I love the last one that says lavish or extravagant. You know, if you're having crab, it seems to us very lavish, but for them, it's like, no, this is what they eat on the East Coast. But I was just, what does that have to be there? I mean, what?
Okay, so where are you at?
It's when you're talking about gift of substantial value.
Okay, so you're looking at the, I gotcha.
Yeah, so it just,
Yeah.
when you're eating, I mean, how in the world am I gonna decide whether it's lavish or
Look,
extravagant?
I don't think, if you are
I'm sorry, I
at,
can't eat this. Could you get me something else?
if you are at a conference and you are, you know, it's
We had
the.
lobster one time, I'm sorry, I'm gonna admit it.
It's probably cheaper than a steak.
Probably
Okay, let
was.
me make a note here and then yeah. You know, I think you need to be more concerned if one of our contractors or prospective contractors says, I wanna take you out to dinner and talk to you about a proposal I have, that, you know what I mean? That's really sort of the issue. When you're traveling to a conference or that sort of thing, you know,
Alright.
you're doing what everybody else is doing. So for example, when I go to the NAPA conference, we always do a meal with Ice Miller, our contract tax counsel. I pay for that myself. They don't pay for my dinner. I eat the meals that the conference provides, and whatever that is fine. But, you know, and I'm not even saying that you necessarily have to always pay for your own meal, but I, you know, use some judgment and,
Alright, I just wanted to make sure, cause it does, you know, those are just one of those, yeah, this is pretty lavish.
I
This is-
certainly
pretty
can
extravagant.
look at revising the questionnaire or the policy language if that's
That's alright, I just wanted you to hear those words, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Before I say I don't do it.
Yeah. No, I think you're fine.
That can be, I mean, it doesn't, and is not lavish or extravagant, isn't really pertinent to the policy, you know, I mean, it could be removed if you wanted to.
Well, I will have to look and see, because now that I'm seeing that it's in the policy, I'm not sure that isn't in the statute.
I think it's a good discussion.
Yeah, you just need to know, I just
Yeah.
need to know. We don't
I
always know who's
mean,
paying for that, you know,
Yeah. I don't expect you to call me up and ask me if lobster at the conference dinner is lavish, but, you know, if you ever have a question about it, you can certainly always
Okay.
ask the question as well, but that's not the problem.
Right, any of the meals provided by the
And that's
conference,
what
Right,
we're
right.
paying for it.
Correct,
So
we are,
I don't
yes.
think you have to worry at all.
No,
about
exactly
that.
right. Nope, exactly right. So relevant to this policy, the language that Carrie was just asking about is in the definition of a gift of substantial value, and that threshold, that $50 threshold, is established in state statute. You know, once again, it's sort of a use good judgment, and I've not ever had any indication that
Nobody's giving us money.
you know, in other circumstances, you've probably attended conferences where there were I think it's gotten to be far less common than it used to be, but in my prior private industry life, I certainly attended conferences where, you know, they were giving trips away to really nice places if you would attend a 2-hour meeting with it, you know, so it happens.
Okay.
And those are the kinds of things you need to be concerned about. So, the relevant definitions here are advancing a private interest. You do what you do, both as fiduciaries and under state ethics law, as in the best interest of TRS members and for no other purpose. You don't advance your own personal interests, you don't advance the private interests of other individuals, your family members, friends, other entities that you work for, work with, represent, whatever the case may be. This is the exclusive benefit rule, which is both a qualification standard for the retirement system and an ethical obligation of a fiduciary. So you're working in the best interests of our members. You're not accepting gifts of substantial value, you're not accepting compensation from other people for the work that you do for TRS. Again, that does not mean that you are being compensated if you're foregoing your $50 per diem and accepting your regular compensation for your 2 public employments. That does not violate the requirement. You take your official actions as TRS board members in the best interests of our members and for no other reason. There's a definition on page 2 here of what constitutes a private interest, and that becomes more relevant when we get into the specifics about prohibited transactions and the like. For purposes of this policy, TRS personnel is any TRS board member, TRS staff. We haven't done this training this year with our staff yet, but we will do it between now and the end of January at a staff meeting. We will do the training with our staff. Our staff all sign the same conflict of interest questionnaire every year as well. So essentially, this board policy lays out appropriate conduct of duties both for TRS board members and for our staff members. And I'm going to sort of skip the what you do. Exercise prudence, do your job in the benefit of TRS, do it according to the training standards that have been conveyed to you, ask questions. When you don't know the answer, keep private information private. I'm synopsizing, but all of those things fall within the ethical responsibilities of our staff members, our board members, and the fiduciary duties of our board. So the questionnaire is a sort of separate obligation that's reflected in this policy, and that is if you become aware of a circumstance, if you personally have a conflict of interest. I think you probably all remember that part of your fiduciary duties is a duty to tattle on other people. You have an obligation not only not to have a conflict of interest yourself, but to disclose other individuals' conflicts of interest or improper conduct when you become aware of it, to prevent it from becoming. You can violate your own fiduciary duties by not making TRS aware of violations by other people when you become aware of them.
Well, I don't know how many of these Raymond James cups I got, damn it, but this could be a conflict of interest.
It's not a conflict of interest because they actually came from a prior board member.
Really?
Jim was a. So, yeah.
So now you know where the bar is set.
Yeah,
Right.
coffee cups are not a substantial gift.
We need to bring in some DA Davidson mugs.
There you go.
Yeah.
We do have
Your
a
picture on them.
cupboard
Yeah.
full of mugs right now, so
Are
we're
they nicer
probably
than
good.
Much nicer.
Oh, okay.
So TRS personnel are not allowed to use the prestige or influence of their position for personal gain or for the gain of a family member, a friend. You can't use retirement system facilities personnel for purposes other than the business of TRS. I will be honest with you, many of these things have less application to you as board members than they do to TRS staff and state employees in general. You can't use the confidential information of TRS to advance a private interest. You shouldn't be using the confidential information of TRS for any purpose other than TRS business. And mostly I say that because we don't have confidential information the way that private entities have confidential information. We have either protected personal information or public information for the most part. So, you know, you're going to be more concerned about using the prestige or influence than you are the confidential information. You are not allowed to, again, accept compensation from a third party for the work that you do for TRS. You can't seek, receive, or accept directly or indirectly any gift from any person who is seeking to do business with the retirement system or who does business with the retirement system. You can't use your TRS position to influence the employment opportunities of your family members, your friends, or other people with TRS. You can't perform any act or conduct other than in your personnel capacity for TRS that you know may be subject directly or indirectly to oversight by TRS. So essentially that is, you don't have a conflict of interest with the business functions of the retirement system. You can't participate in any ex parte communications with me, with Sean, with Tammy, with any other TRS staff about contested matters that are going on, litigation matters that are going on. You are the final arbiters of fact and law with respect to cases that come before the TRS board. Before those matters reach your level, they are things that are managed by staff and not things that you deal with. And that's to prevent you from being accused of having a conflict of interest or a predetermined, a bias or a lack of objectivity when it comes time for you to make the decision you're legally required to make. Some of these things I'm not going to go over specifically because they're incorporated in other. We also have the board communications policy, which spells out more specifically what your responsibilities are for public communications related to your TRS duties and functions. Part B of the policy on page 49 is more specifically about your fiduciary duties, prohibited transactions and self-dealing, and this gets us firmly into the notion of conflicts of interest. It talks first about the sort of individual named fiduciary duties that you have. We went over those last time. We won't go over them again in great detail. The prohibition against self-dealing, once again, is the biggest issue. You do not advance your own interests in the work you do for TRS. You advance the interests of TRS as a whole and the TRS membership in general, and that's it. With respect to conflicts of interest, I always point this out. Best way not to have a conflict of interest problem is not to have a conflict of interest. And I will say sometimes they're unavoidable. I mean, sometimes you have lives, you have professions, and sometimes you know your life goes a different direction, and you have a business interest or whatever that directly conflicts with your responsibilities for TRS. And the appropriate thing to do at that point is remove yourself from the TRS board. So I mean, I know that's an extreme sort of example, and I'm quite certain that none of you are there, but you know, leaving the TRS board is not the worst thing that ever happened, and it is the appropriate thing to do if you cannot resolve, you know, avoid a conflict in another manner. We always look at conflicts of interest, not only for, and this sort of gets back to the gift of a substantial value. Do I believe that a lobster dinner is going to buy your conduct as a TRS board member? No, I don't. But, you know, gifts of substantial value at least raise the appearance of a potential conflict of interest, and an appearance of a conflict of interest can be a conflict of interest whether or not there actually is the quid pro quo that might be perceived from the exchange of something of value. So, always look at your conduct, and you're sort of accustomed to doing that when we have disability determinations to make, and I have conversations with you about whether you know the person, and we have taken a very sort of, in general, I think very broad view of an appearance of a conflict of interest. And most of the time when you have a personal relationship, you work with the person, you're aware of their particular circumstances that give rise to their claim against TRS, whatever the case may be, we opt for putting on the record the potential for an appearance of a conflict of interest, and you abstain from conversation and voting on the matter. It's kind of a good view to take of your behavior in general. I mean, if you have any concern that there may be an appearance of a conflict of interest, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is one, and that doesn't necessarily mean there's a conflict of interest that can't be overcome by putting it on the record, and taking appropriate, remedial steps to avoid the actual conflict. But you need to talk to me about that, you need to talk to Sean about that, you can go to the board chair about it, bring it to somebody's attention, and let's figure out what we need to do with it. Unless anybody has specific questions, since we went through the fiduciary duties in that last time, I'd like to move right on to the disclosure statement. And since it is largely, and the questions that are asked is largely a restatement of the policy that we've reviewed, I'm not going to go through it in great detail as well. You need to provide your name. You need to initial on page 2 where it says, I have reviewed the state ethics policy and TRS's ethical conduct conflict of interest policy. I always say this, and I know that it sounds flippant, but the right answer to each one of the questions is no. I mean, the answer that automatically says, I don't have a conflict of interest, or I'm not aware of any other conflicts of interest, is no. But of course, the right answer is whatever the right answer is. And if you need to answer yes to one of those questions, then I would recommend first that you talk to me, so we know for sure that you really do have something that's potentially a conflict of interest that needs to be disclosed. Again, most of the time when people have asked me questions, it gets into the realm of, I'm both a teacher, or I have other board participation, other entity board participation obligations or that, and what you have really is not a conflict of interest. Otherwise, if we identify a true conflict of interest, we're going to put it down on another piece of paper. We're going to figure out how it's appropriately dealt with, whether it's disclosure, whether it's, your board participation ceases, whatever the case may be. With this particular group of board members, I've never had a reported conflict of interest. So, you can complete those today and leave them if you'd like. You can take them and review them when you get home and mail them back in. It's not imperative that we have them today, but, by the February board meeting would be fine. Every time we go over these policies, I will just throw in as an aside, every time we go through these trainings, whether it's the board, and this gets back to Carrie's question, whether it's the board communications, whether it's the ethics and conflict of interest policy, or whatever the case may be, please as well feel free to make any new comments, anything you've noticed in the policy that you think needs to be removed, you don't understand it, it needs to be clarified, it needs to be whatever the case may be, because this should also absolutely be a process where we're looking at our policy, or can be a process where we're looking at the policy and addressing any concerns with those too.
questions or anything?
Okay, so we're on to the long-term, or long-range planning, our commitment worksheet.
Yes, so Madam Chair, members of the board, behind tab 10 in your binder, there's the long-range planning section. I did include the strategic planning commitment worksheet, and as I stated in my comment there, I have not updated anything yet, although I think the one related to workspace, which is where,
Third one, long-term plans to increase workplace, no, that's efficiency.
so,
New or remodeled, that's it.
Yep, it's the top one.
oh yeah, right, it's the very first one. So that right now is a number one with a timeline of 2017, 2018. I don't know that we need to change it, I guess just recognize that if we decide to go through the long-range building process, you know, nothing will actually happen as far as construction until the summer of 2019 at the earliest. But we still want to keep planning and moving this forward, so.
I think it might make sense to change it to 17 and 19.
17 and 19, okay, and I think that's easy enough to do, I'll make that update. And the planning efforts will continue as we discussed earlier. Beyond that, I did not make any updates to anything. I did want to just have a short discussion about, on the second page of those, so it's page 57 of your packet, that very top objective strategy. This is how Jim Cairns sort of verbalized this objective, and I just want to make sure that I understand what the board's expectation with that is. But it says develop and implement outreach, external, and change management, internal efforts to communicate and effectively manage organizational improvements, changes to member services and internal business processes, and foster positive perception of change. I think what we're looking for, the outcome of measure is improved customer service, internal change management, continuous quality improvement. So externally, I think it's straightforward enough, I understand it. I think internally, there might not be very many like outputs other than just involvement, staff involvement in change management, I think is what we were looking for there. But I want to make sure I'm not thinking of that, this outcome or measure or objective incorrect. But I think that's what we were talking, because we were talking about it in terms of potential move, office move, as well as workflow, a workflow solution where it's going to be, you know, that's going to be a drastic change to how we conduct our day-to-day business, where right now we get a paper folder that makes its way all the way through the office, instead of what will happen in the future, we'll get the paper in and scan it, and it's everything will be distributed electronically. So I think what we were talking about there
That was it.
was just change management and making sure the staff is involved in the process and trying to, you know, get buy-in from them, I believe is what we're looking for internal.
Well, that's most of what.
Part of that was the input in the advancement of the M-Trust and all those advances.
Yes, and that could, yep, and that's a good one too. I like, and we certainly do that. I mean, they take part in the requirements gathering that I mean, it seems like forever ago now, but we did a lot of work on requirements gathering that staff is involved in.
Each functional team is involved in any requirements, and they were involved in the fact that in this phase of, you know, what things would you like now that it's in place, what would you like, or how could we improve existing functionality, and so they were involved in all of that.
I think as we look forward to potential change in locale, there's huge change issues associated with all of that. So I think it implies also that, you know, that we'll express them, consider planned change and how that influences our staff.
Okay. It just, I guess
It almost
The
sounds like, let's
outcome,
change
the-
the management.
Well, yeah.
It's just gonna be,
No wonder he was nervous.
there's not really well, what I'm not nervous, I don't know what I'll be able to show at some point in the future as an
Yeah,
output, you know what I mean? So I just wanna make sure.
Well, you sort of alluded to that earlier on today when you said that because of the M-change efficiencies created among your staff, maybe you've shifted your expectation for how many new employees might need to be added over the next 5 to 10 years. Correct?
Yep.
Yep.
And I would also say that, you know, with the addition of the workflow, that will play into that, because right now there's inefficiencies in the fact that we're trying to chase around and find a file. When we have a workflow system, it's done electronically, we're always gonna know where we're at in the process on that person's file. When they call and ask, where are we at, or where are you at in processing my application, or, you know, where's my estimate, or something like that, we'll know who has it, where it's at, what phase of the process
That'll
they're
be
in.
great for
Yep,
your teachers.
yep.
Yeah, it'll be, and once staff is accustomed to the change, I think they're gonna really appreciate it
Yeah.
as well. I mean, it's, but I mean, we're not even kidding anybody, that's gonna be a big project with a lot of work involved. I mean, everything is gonna have to be mapped and.
So you think about every piece of paper that comes in this office, we're gonna have to have a process flow for that piece of paper. You know, where does it go, who handles it, how many times, what, you know, just every little step, no matter from a handwritten note to an official form that, you know, one of our forms. So, that's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. When it's done, it'll be
It'll be
amazing,
nice.
but it's gonna be a
Yeah.
lot of work to get there for sure.
Yeah.
I think we're up to it. We're planting the seeds already with staff. It's
Yeah.
like, this is gonna be coming down the road.
I mean, some benefit out of our failed project from back in 2000 when we went with, we were looking at PeopleSoft. I mean, we went through and did a lot of work on process flows. They have already been generated. However, with the M-Trust, some of the steps have changed, but at least we have a foundation to begin with that we can modify. And we were actually talking about it yesterday. You can see up on the board all the handwritten notes. We're just trying to, that's simply one little small, and that's not it's not well laid out in a process. I mean, it's well laid out on the board there, but what limited space we have, but we need to take that and go back and look at the actual process flow that was generated back when we were looking at the PeopleSoft project, seeing what can we change and, you know, use that going forward, and we'll do the same. I mean, like I said, every piece of paper will have to have something similar of how we're handling when we're gonna process it, so it'll be a huge effort, but well worth it in the end, so. That is, yeah. That's the only
Very
positive.
expensive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ironically, that's exactly what I thought of as we were going through that last exercise.
Yeah.
In terms of proposal changes, we have conflict with that too, so.
Yeah.
A conflict with PeopleSoft
Uh,
project?
One of our employees went to work for
Oh.
Counsel,
Yeah, okay.
and then tried to influence us on some other things.
Sure.
Really?
He wasn't very popular at that point in time, so he didn't get very far with that.
Statute
Yeah.
of limitations things.
So I would,
It was only him.
I would throw in just in the conversation quickly that, you know, earlier we mentioned online forms and the beneficiary designation form. And really and truly, as part of the scope of the project overall, you know, the conversation of the scope of the project, the online forms are really sort of online transactions. And how do you put your, you know, specific business processes in an electronic format? So, I mean, we're already realizing that, you know, some of the complexity of moving from paper comes through the door and who touches it and what, with the online transactions issues that we're addressing. And, yeah, you know, I mean, it is a huge amount of contemplation of what your business processes are, what your people really do, how people from the outside, you know, how our members and that interact with, it's, you know, so we're gonna be light years ahead after phase 2 going into workflow, but,
Yeah,
I'm actually looking forward to it. I know that it's gonna be a lot of work,
Yeah.
and I know I'll be heavily involved in that, but I'm really looking forward to it, because I think it will be a huge improvement. I mean, I've been here so long, this room used to be full of file cabinets, and we used to, follow those files around this office and track them down. I mean, we've come a long ways since then, but still we have a long ways to go. And workflow is definitely the right step for us. And it may, like Sean was saying, we may be at the staffing level that we need once we get workflow in place. In the efficiencies that we're gaining from Entrust alone has helped a lot.
So if M-Trust is now expected to be completed sometime in January of 2019, roughly how much beyond that point do you expect that it'll take you to get your staff completely up to speed on the utilization of that?
Of M-Trust?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, that's kind of a hard question to answer, only because we release it in modular releases, so by the time we get to January, there'll be some of these modules in the beginning that they've already been using for a year. I don't know, what do you think, maybe 6 months at the most? I mean, because they're using most of it already, and then as more things are released, they'll be using it every day.
And how disruptive would a physical change during that process be? You said one time several meetings ago, Sean, that you thought it would be way more efficient if you started to do the implementation of a completed M-Trust just subsequent to, or just after a completed move. Because if you did the move right in the middle of that implementation, it might be more disruptive in terms of your efficiencies.
So the only worry there, well, I shouldn't say only, the biggest worry there for me would be if we had if the move were to interrupt our testing schedule for more than a week or two. And it probably wouldn't, it probably wouldn't be more than 1 week, but our testing schedule is pretty, it's kind of on the razor's edge. The development and the testing are both kind of at capacity, and they have to kind of go just right, or else either way we'll go over. And I think that would be my only concern. But now, if the move were all mapped out and planned well, which it should be if we got to that point, we should be able to set up our testing stations that we usually have in this room to wherever we're going, and hopefully only miss a day or two.
But realistically, it's not gonna be until June of 19 anyway, before you could do anything, since it's gotta go through a legislative session.
Right.
Yeah.
If you're going that route, yes.
So it's
So it might be done.
not really an
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah.
There was some conversation about when we were looking at doing the move to Park Avenue, that might all occur in February, this coming February, and, it would have been relatively quick. We would have probably tried to move on a Friday, or even potentially, have the movers move things on a Saturday, Sunday, and really not miss much actual staff time at all. But it would be disruptive to the extent you might miss a day or two here and there. I don't think it would put us back terribly.
No, because we schedule two days a week with the functional teams, if they're actually, if we're actually truly getting the functional team members in here and we're actually testing with them. Monica and I spend, not every day, but pretty much.
Quite a bit,
Yeah.
And you could really do that from anywhere if you had to, right?
Yeah, oh, absolutely, yeah, I'm on a virtual desktop, as long as I have Citrus access, I can log into my virtual desktop, as well as like Monica does it remotely from home. But twice a week, we have functional team members in here. For instance, for example, retirement payroll. We set up 3 testing sessions with them. 2 happened this week, and we have 1 more next week. And then that's it. But prior to that, Monica, myself, Darla, Rex, we're all working, trying to, kind of flush things out and make sure that it's ready for the functional team members to come in, because we don't want to present to them, simple bugs that, it's something that's supposed to appear on the screen and it's not. Well, that's things that we can work through all that. And we want them to focus on, here's their business process they have to complete. We want them to be able to come in and just sit down and actually test that. So we do a lot of the flushing out to begin with before we bring them in. But like I said, we only typically have 2 days a week with a functional team member for a setup test case where you would have more than just a couple of folks, staff members that are truly testing. And so if we scheduled it right, it would be pretty minimal
Yeah.
impact, you know,
I do remember saying that though, and
yeah.
I think that at the most, you know, we would end up losing a week or two potentially of testing.
Well, the point Jeff just made, you're likely to be doing it here since you're not gonna get approval until months after
Right.
Yeah.
interest. That may be an advantage, because if you learn, by example, things that aren't working in terms of your workflow process, you could shift those or adjust those in a new space.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Is phase 4 starting right after phase 3 is done, or is there a pause?
Well, it won't be a phase or called interest. So I think we'll likely have a punch list when this is all over. But we have our normal contract, under it, we have, whether you call it maintenance or enhancement, we have the ability to have Alfred and Roy do development work for us at the ad hoc rate under our just maintenance contract. So I think hopefully we won't have a phase 4, but we likely will have a punch list of things we want to get done.
Okay.
And then workflow will be a new project unto itself. You know, and that's really perceptive content management, which is the imaging software and the mapping and electronic, coding of how things move through the TRS. I can't tell you exactly what that looks like, but I know that there's resources out there, because lots of companies and even potentially some state agencies have already implemented workflow, but you have to customize it to your processes.
But hopefully we can position this next project where we can hopefully keep some of the same, project management, testing type, not have to really, not let them go somewhere else, put it that way, because consistency, it's institutional knowledge is there, and they've gained a lot over these last 3 years, and it would be helpful to have them involved in our workflow process. I know it would make my life a lot easier, for sure, just having their help. So, yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Anything else on that commitment workshop?
No, I didn't have any other updates or sort of discussion items that I had planned for the board. Do any of the board members have any questions about the worksheet? It hasn't changed since last one. So that's all I have on that.
Thank you very much. So do we have a disability application?
No,
Okay, I didn't see any, so I was like, okay. So no disabilities, we don't have to close the meeting.
Came right down to the wire, but no.
yeah, this morning I was practically typing something up for you, but then I should have listened to my voice note before I started typing.
Oh. Okay, so we are, need a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded, all those in favor, indicate by saying aye.
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 Yeah.
We are gonna be home.
I'm supposed to take the binders with us, right?
No.
But I can take the contents.
Did you want to? No, sir.